Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, as we continue to analyze this conflict, this war, it is becoming glaringly apparent that the Russians are quickly adapting to modern war, especially the use of more advanced Western air defense missiles. So the Russians are adapting to the Ukrainian use of these Patriots, of these possible use of French Aster 30s that are being forward deployed against Russian forces. And how are the Russians changing their doctrine? What are the Russians doing differently that we didn't see the Russians do in the early stages of the conflict, or even in the middle stages of the conflict? That is the use of GLONASS guided glide bombs, the likes of what you'll see on this aircraft here. This is a Su-34 fullback armed with 4 GLONASS glide bombs. Now, these bombs are released dozens and dozens of kilometers behind the line of contact, behind the front lines. And these bombs are then able to glide 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 kilometers and precisely strike an aim point, just like the U.S. JDAM, very much like the U.S. JDAM. The Russians are using these on 1,000-pound, 2,000-pound, and now 6,000-pound glide bombs. Fab 250s, Fab 1500s, and then Fab 3000s. The Russians are hitting about, right now, as we speak, up to 1,000 aim points per month. They're launching about 100 sorties. Each aircraft carries between 4 or more of these glide bombs, possibly more in terms of aircraft sorties, up to 200 in some cases, to get to that 1,000 aim point strike. And that is taking a toll on the Ukrainian military. Have the Ukrainians been able to shoot down some Russian aircraft? Yes, they have. But we've only seen an uptick in the amount of aim points the Russians are able to target with these glide bombs. It's taking a toll. So now we're starting to hear rhetoric. We're starting to hear the shaping of a narrative, right now coming from France, that envisions the deployment of French forces into Western Ukraine. Now, initially, we here at MFAN believe that the French strategy will be to create an air defense zone in Western Ukraine around Lviv and other Western Ukrainian cities. This will also provide a theater level of air defense against Russian GLONASS guided bombs that could be used to target staging areas for Ukrainian F-16s, future facing. But that's where it's going to start. The French will start to deploy its theater air defense systems, these Aster 30s, these SAMP-Ts, in Western Ukraine, manned by French soldiers, French forces, to create this perceived no-fly zone in Western Ukraine. Again, it'll be under the guise of humanitarian purposes. The French military is simply setting up an air exclusion zone where the Russians cannot bomb civilians in Western Ukraine. That will be the narrative. Now, that will give the French the ability to slowly push that air defense zone east. And eventually we will see French forces outside of Kiev. And then at some point, the Russians are going to respond. Will it be early? Will it be later? It's difficult to say. But at some point, the Russians are going to respond to French forces putting air defense systems designed to shoot down Russian missiles and ultimately Russian aircraft in western and then eventually eastern Ukraine. Now, when the Russians target these French forces and kill French troops, that is when you will hear from Joseph Biden, you will hear from Western European allies that aren't fully on board to the deployment of NATO forces in Western Ukraine, then change the narrative and say, well, look, the Russians attacked a NATO ally that had simply set up an air defense zone to protect, quote unquote, Western Europe. It'll change. They'll remove the verbiage of Ukraine. And it will be French soldiers were killed protecting Western Europe. Remember the cruise missile that strayed into Poland? That is going to be the pretext for putting those French forces in Western Ukraine. But the minute those French forces get into Western Ukraine, they're going to push those air defense systems further east to try and have a direct impact on the front lines, to keep and eventually prevent Russian aircraft from operating in eastern Ukraine and even possibly engaging Russian aircraft inside of Russia themselves. Now, what are the Russians doing? Well, the Russians are contemplating what to do next. I've talked about the continued deployment of Russian forces, specifically the buildup of Russian forces in the region of Belgorod, Kupiansk, and it looks like the Russians are formulating a contingency plan for large-scale offensive operations against Kharkiv. Now, option number 2, depending on what happens with this continued Russian air campaign using these GLONASS guided bombs, glide bombs, against the Ukrainian military, I think at some point the Russian high command is going to ask, well, how degraded is the Ukrainian military? Is it close to collapsing? Could we effectively launch a campaign in the direction of Kiev and cut off the head of the snake? Could we make the Zelenskyy regime flee Kiev? Could we besiege Kiev and take control of Kiev? I think the Russians are asking that question right now. So two options for the Russians that are on the table right now. And I think there is debate within the Russian leadership over what to do next. I think the strategy for right now and going into summer is to continue the use of these very effective GLONASS glide bomb campaigns against Ukrainian forces, which, again, is having a serious impact on the Ukrainian army. But as the Russians see the Ukrainian military start to collapse and start to unglue, start to come apart, as we see the Ukrainian society start to fracture over the massive losses that are ongoing, the lack of desire for Ukrainian fighting age males to join the Ukrainian military, in which the Ukrainians then start to utilize forced conscription as the army's morale continues to wane and decrease. Will the Russians consider an offensive on Kharkiv or a move towards Kiev? Are the Russians considering a buffer zone east of the Dnieper River, controlling the second largest Ukrainian city? Or could the Russians be preparing for something even bigger? And we don't know yet. But I believe as we move towards summer, late summer, depending on how effectively this Russian glide bomb campaign continues, again, 1,000 aim points a month being hit by Russian forces, at what point and what target will the Russians go after? I think it could be both. I think at first the Russians will look to siege Kharkiv, envelop and seek the capitulation of Kharkiv. Now, depending on the Ukrainian will to fight, in how things are going for both the Russian military in terms of its continued buildup, its military-industrial capacity, and the increasing size of the Russian ground forces, and the waning morale, and the decrease in the Ukrainian ability to fight, depending on what happens in Kharkiv, I think we could see a renewed move towards Kiev. I have to wonder if the Russian leadership, with the recent strikes that have been ongoing throughout the Russian Federation, are not asking this question. Can we live with any form of a Ukrainian state that gravitates towards NATO, even if the whatever remains of Ukraine does not become part of NATO? It is still going to be rearmed, and it's still going to hold, in terms of the Russian perception, aspirations of the reconquest of Crimea. And so the Russians must ask themselves, do we permanently remove this threat? Have a good day. More to come. As always, a pleasure. We'll talk in the comment section.